Chapter 1. The Invitation. A yellowed envelope arrived on a crisp autumn morning, its wax seal stamped with a symbol long forgotten by time. The paper crackled as it was unfolded, revealing a letter written in elegant, looping script. The ink, deep and almost black, shimmered faintly in the dim light of dawn. An invitation, brief, mysterious, and bearing no signature, requested the reader's presence at an estate hidden deep within the forest, far from the eyes of the world. The forest road was ancient, carved by time itself, winding between towering oaks and twisted pines. Shadows stretched long and dark as the sun dipped below the horizon. The path narrowed, forcing any traveler into single file, as if it were funneling them towards something inevitable. The house emerged from the fog, a towering structure of crumbling stone and weathered wood. Ivy strangled the walls, as if nature itself were trying to keep something contained within. The windows were dark, lifeless, but a single light flickered in the highest tower, beckoning any who dared to approach. The front door creaked open before a hand could reach it, revealing a grand but decaying entrance hall. Dust hung heavy in the air, swirling lazily with each step. Faded portraits lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the visitor's every move. A chill lingered, more than just the bite of autumn. It was as though the walls themselves breathed a cold, unwelcome breath. At the center of the hall stood a table, set with a single candle burning low. On the table lay a ledger, its cover cracked and dry. Pages yellowed with age rustled, as if turned by unseen hands. The invitation had been accepted, and the house had come alive in anticipation. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as if warning against what lay ahead. The candle's flame flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the room. The darkness thickened, pooling at the edges of vision, creeping closer, eager to consume. The door behind slowly creaked shut, sealing the fate of those who had crossed the threshold. The invitation was just the beginning. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Fog. The house seemed to exhale as the front door closed with a muffled thud, plunging the interior into a deeper darkness. The candle's flicker was now the only source of light, casting long, trembling shadows that clung to the walls like sentient entities. Outside, the fog had thickened, curling around the base of the house in ghostly tendrils. It seeped through the cracks in the walls and under the doors, creating a misty haze that obscured everything beyond the immediate surroundings. The forest beyond seemed to dissolve into an impenetrable void. In the dim light, the staircase loomed, its wooden steps creaking under unseen weight. The walls leading up were lined with old, cobweb-covered tapestries, their once vivid colors now faded into splotches of gray. Each step seemed to groan in protest as the unseen visitor made their way upward, the air growing colder with each ascent. On the second floor, the hallways stretched out like an endless maze. Doors stood ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms frozen in time. Dusty furniture lay covered in white sheets, their shapes distorted in the dim light. Antique clocks ticked in disjointed harmony, their sounds echoing like whispers in the void. One door stood out, a dark mahogany door, slightly ajar, with a tarnished brass handle. The faintest hint of light escaped through the crack, casting a strange, flickering glow. As the door slowly swung open, a gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it a whisper of long-lost secrets. Inside, the room was a study, filled with rows of ancient books whose spines were cracked and worn. The air was thick with the musty scent of old paper and leather. A large desk dominated the center, cluttered with open books and yellowed parchment. On the wall behind the desk hung a large, ornate mirror, its surface dark and clouded, as if it had not been cleaned in decades. The mirror seemed to pulse with a strange energy, its reflection warping and twisting in the candlelight. In the shifting darkness, It almost appeared as if something were moving within its depths, watching with unseen eyes. The candle's flame flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the room. As it dimmed, the shadows grew longer and more insistent, creeping across the walls and floor as if searching for something hidden, something that should never have been disturbed. The silence of the house deepened, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant sound of the wind outside. The fog continued to swirl, an ever-present reminder of the world that lay beyond the estate's walls. The visitor stood alone, surrounded by the silent witnesses of a bygone era, as the house began to come alive with a sense of foreboding. Chapter 3: The Cursed House. The night deepened as the visitor explored further into the heart of the house. The candle's light flickered and danced, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to stretch and shrink with each step taken. Each corridor and room uncovered a new layer of the estate's dark history. The visitor's path led to the dining hall, a cavernous space dominated by an enormous, dust-covered table. The table's surface was strewn with the remnants of a long-abandoned feast. Tarnished silverware, cracked porcelain plates, and dried-up wine stains. The once grand chandelier above was now a tangled mass of cobwebs and dust, its crystals dull and lifeless. At the far end of the hall, a large fireplace stood cold and dark. The hearth was empty, save for a few charred logs and a thick layer of ash. The mantel was adorned with grim, faded photographs, portraits of stern faces and dark eyes. They seemed to watch the visitor with an unsettling intensity, their expressions frozen in time. The visitor's attention was drawn to an old grandfather clock standing against one wall. Its pendulum had long stopped swinging, and its face was obscured by grime. The clock's hands were frozen at midnight, a symbol of unending time or an ominous curse. The second hand, however, seemed to twitch ever so slightly, as if trapped in a never-ending loop. Moving deeper into the house, the visitor came across a library, its walls lined with shelves crammed full of ancient, leather-bound volumes. The books were covered in thick layers of dust, their spines cracked and fragile. A few books lay scattered on the floor, their pages open as if left in haste. The dim candlelight revealed odd symbols and cryptic notations within the books, their meanings lost to time. In the center of the room, a large, ornate globe stood still. Its surface was covered in a thick layer of dust, but a single handprint was clearly visible, as if someone had recently touched it. The globe's countries and continents were faded and worn, and it seemed to spin slowly, driven by some unseen force. Nearby, a narrow door, barely noticeable, led down a steep staircase. The steps were covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for years. As the visitor descended, the air grew colder and more oppressive. The staircase led to a small, underground chamber. The walls were lined with shelves holding strange artifacts, skulls, old maps, and odd trinkets, all arranged meticulously, as if part of a dark ritual. In the center of the room stood an old, weathered altar, its surface covered in strange markings and dried stains. A single candle, much like the one carried by the visitor, burned on the altar, casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. The flame flickered erratically, illuminating an ancient book open on the altar, its pages filled with strange symbols and faded writing. The air in the chamber was thick with an almost tangible darkness. The artifacts seemed to hum with a latent energy, their presence a reminder of the house's dark history and the curses that might still linger within its walls. The visitor felt a growing sense of dread, an awareness that the house was not merely a relic of the past, but a living entity watching and waiting. The silence was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the faint rustling of the book's pages in the draft that flowed through the chamber. The cursed house had revealed its secrets, But there was still more to uncover, more darkness to explore, more shadows to confront. The visitor's journey had only just begun. Chapter 4: Whispers from the Basement. The house seemed to shift and groan as the visitor made their way toward the basement, guided by an inexplicable pull. The staircase leading down was narrow and steep, the steps worn smooth by countless feet. The walls were cold and damp, covered in thick layers of mold that gave off a musty, rancid odor. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched out like a forgotten realm. Flickering candlelight illuminated a vast expanse of cobwebs and decay. The air was thick with the smell of earth and rot, and the dim light barely cut through the oppressive gloom. The basement was cluttered with abandoned belongings. Old furniture draped in tattered sheets, broken mirrors with cracked glass, and dusty crates filled with forgotten trinkets. The wooden beams overhead were covered in layers of grime and spiderwebs, their dark shapes creating a web of shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. In one corner of the basement, an old wooden table was strewn with strange objects, rusted tools, odd relics, and an assortment of jars containing murky liquids. Among them, an open book lay with pages yellowed and brittle, filled with cryptic diagrams and faded text. The faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to emanate from the book, as if it were alive with some dark, ancient knowledge. A large, iron-bound chest stood against one wall, its surface etched with intricate symbols and worn from age. The chest's lock was old and corroded, and as the visitor approached, the air seemed to grow colder. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering could be heard, rising and falling like a distant, mournful song. The whispers seemed to emanate from the chest itself, their source a mystery lost in the depths of the basement. The visitor's attention was drawn to a series of strange, rune-covered stones arranged in a circle on the floor. The stones were cold to the touch, and as the visitor approached, the whispers grew louder, forming fragmented words that were barely discernible. The circle seemed to pulse with an eerie light, and the shadows danced wildly around it, creating an unsettling, otherworldly atmosphere. Beside the circle, an old, rusted iron furnace loomed, its door slightly ajar. The furnace emitted an unnatural chill, and as the visitor peered inside, they saw nothing but darkness. The feeling of being watched intensified, the shadows seeming to close in, pressing against the walls and ceiling. On the far side of the basement, a small door led to an even darker recess. The door was heavy and aged, its surface marked with deep scratches and faint bloodstains. The visitor hesitated before pushing it open, revealing a tiny, cluttered room filled with old, broken furniture and piles of yellowed newspapers. The walls were covered in strange, hastily scrawled symbols and drawings, their meaning obscure and frightening. In the center of the room, a small altar stood, covered in dust and grime. On the altar lay a collection of faded photographs, their subjects blurred and indistinct. The photographs were surrounded by candles, their wicks long since burned down to stubs. The faint, ghostly light they cast seemed to flicker in time with the whispers that now filled the air, creating an atmosphere of palpable dread. The visitor moved cautiously through the room, their every step accompanied by the unsettling whispers that seemed to grow more intense. The presence of something dark and malevolent was undeniable, a force that lurked just beyond the edges of perception. The basement held many secrets, and the whispers were a reminder that the darkness within the house was far from benign. The visitor's exploration of the basement had unveiled only a fragment of the house's malevolent history. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, as if urging the visitor to leave before the darkness fully revealed itself. The basement, with its secrets and shadows, was a place where the past and present intertwined, creating an ever-deepening sense of unease. Chapter 5: An Omen of Blood. The house seemed to grow colder as the visitor ascended from the basement, the oppressive chill of the lower levels lingering in the upper floors. The walls, once cold and indifferent, now felt almost alive, pulsing with an unseen, malevolent energy. In the dim light of the hallway, a deep crimson stain marred the otherwise pristine white wallpaper. It dripped slowly down the wall, as though something or someone had been violently dragged from one end of the corridor to the other. The stain seemed to spread and shift, forming grotesque shapes that resembled twisted faces and anguished figures. The visitor's steps echoed through the corridor, each footfall stirring up a faint rustle of unseen movement. The stain led to a door at the end of the hallway, its surface marred by dark smudges that seemed to pulse and writhe with the same eerie energy as the stain on the wall. Pushing open the door, the visitor was met with a sight both horrifying and inexplicable. The room was bathed in a dim, reddish light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The floor was covered in a thick layer of crimson liquid, which pooled and swirled with a life of its own. The substance had an oily sheen, and the smell of iron and decay filled the air. On the walls, strange symbols and sigils were etched in a mixture of dark paint and blood, their meanings lost but their presence deeply unsettling. The symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, their forms becoming more intricate and disturbing the longer they were observed. In the center of the room stood an old, weathered chair, its seat stained with dark, dried blood. Around the chair, a series of symbols had been drawn on the floor, creating a circular pattern that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural glow. The chair appeared to be the focal point of some ancient and dark ritual, the epicenter of the ominous energy that filled the room. The visitor's gaze was drawn to the ceiling, where a large, ornate chandelier hung motionless. Its crystals, once brilliant, were now dark and clouded, and the light it cast was strangely red and flickering. The chandelier's shadows danced across the walls, creating eerie, ever-changing patterns that seemed to depict scenes of violence and suffering. As the visitor moved closer to the chair, the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. A thick mist began to rise from the crimson liquid, swirling and coiling around the visitor's legs. The mist carried a sense of foreboding, as if it were whispering secrets of past horrors and unspeakable rites. A sudden draft swept through the room, causing the red light to flicker wildly. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and elongate, reaching out as if to envelop the visitor. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, the very air seeming to press down with a weight that was both physical and psychological. On a small table near the chair lay an assortment of objects: a tarnished dagger, a blood-stained cloth, and a collection of faded, brittle parchments covered in cryptic writing. The dagger's blade was etched with runes, its surface marred by the dark stains of previous use. The cloth was thick with dried blood, and the parchment seemed to tremble slightly, as if alive with some dark, malevolent force. The visitor's eyes were drawn back to the crimson stain on the wall, which now seemed to pulse and throb in rhythm with the visitor's own heartbeat. The ominous energy of the room grew more intense, as if the house itself was feeding off the fear and dread that pervaded every corner. The room, with its dark omens and unsettling presence, was a stark reminder of the house's true nature. The visitor could feel the weight of countless dark rituals and unspeakable horrors that had transpired within these walls. The omen of blood was not just a sign of past violence, but a harbinger of the darkness that awaited in the depths of the house. Chapter 6: The Locked Door. The visitor's exploration led them to a door at the end of a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The door was imposing, made of heavy, dark wood, its surface adorned with intricate carvings of grotesque faces and abstract symbols. The air around it was colder, as if it were the gateway to a place of deeper darkness. The door's lock was old and rusted, a heavy iron contraption that seemed to have been untouched for years. The keyhole was obscured by grime and dust, and the key that once fit had long been lost. A faint, almost imperceptible humming emanated from the door, a low vibration that seemed to resonate with the visitor's every step. The walls on either side of the door were covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs. The visitor noticed faint scratches and dents on the door's surface, as though something or someone had tried to force it open in the past. The scratches were deep and irregular, adding to the door's ominous aura. An old, wrought iron handle hung loosely, its surface cold and unyielding. The handle was encrusted with grime and the occasional dark stain, as though it had been handled by many before. The visitor reached out to turn the handle, but the door remained steadfastly shut. The handle refused to budge, the lock resolutely holding its secrets. Nearby, a small, dust-covered table held a collection of old, forgotten items. Among them were a broken lantern, its glass shattered and its flame long extinguished, and a set of old keys, each one worn and tarnished. The keys were arranged haphazardly, as if someone had carelessly discarded them. The visitor examined the keys, but none seemed to fit the lock on the door. The disappointment was palpable, as the door remained an impenetrable barrier. The room around the door was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the old house settling. The silence was thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of wind whistling through the empty corridors. The visitor's gaze fell upon the carvings on the door, each face and symbol a twisted representation of fear and despair. The carvings seemed to shift and change in the dim light, creating an illusion of movement that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. The faces seemed to express emotions of agony and rage, their eyes hollow and accusing. The visitor noticed a faint, reddish glow emanating from beneath the door. The light was weak and flickering, casting eerie shadows that danced along the floor. It was as though something was trying to escape from the other side, a hint of the darkness that lay beyond. The air grew colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible draft seemed to seep through the cracks around the door. The draft carried with it a faint, metallic scent, like blood mixed with old iron. The visitor felt a chill run down their spine, a sense of dread that grew stronger with each passing moment. Despite the visitor's best efforts, the door remained firmly shut. The sense of frustration and helplessness was palpable, as though the door was deliberately keeping its secrets hidden. The visitor's exploration of the house had revealed many horrors, but this locked door was an enigma, a barrier to a deeper darkness that was yet to be uncovered. The visitors stepped back, their eyes lingering on the door's intricate carvings. The ominous glow from beneath the door continued to flicker, a silent reminder of the secrets that lay beyond. The locked door stood as a testament to the house's malevolent nature, a reminder that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved and some horrors never to be faced. Chapter 7. Stains on the wallpaper. The visitor moved cautiously through the house, their path leading them to a dimly lit hallway on the second floor. The corridor was lined with faded, ornate wallpaper, its once elegant patterns now marred by the passage of time and neglect. As the visitor walked, they noticed that the wallpaper was stained with dark, irregular blotches. The stains, which appeared to be a deep, almost black color, smeared and spread across the walls like a series of ominous, abstract paintings. The patterns of the wallpaper were obscured by these stains, which seemed to form disturbing shapes and figures when viewed from different angles. The stains were not uniform. Some sections were thin and streaky, while others were thick and congealed. The blotches appeared to have been applied with a haphazard hand, their distribution uneven and chaotic. The visitor could not discern the origin of the stains, but their unsettling presence was impossible to ignore. The wallpaper seemed to breathe in the dim light, the stains shifting and changing as if alive. The visitor ran their fingers lightly over the damp, sticky patches, feeling the texture of the dark substance beneath their touch. The stains left a faint, reddish residue on their fingers, which seemed to dry quickly, leaving behind a metallic, acrid scent. The hallway seemed to warp and stretch as the visitor continued down it, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. The stains on the wallpaper appeared to be more concentrated in certain areas, where they formed grotesque shapes and patterns that were both hypnotic and horrifying. Faces seemed to emerge from the stains, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. The visitor reached a small alcove in the hallway, where an old, tarnished mirror hung on the wall. The mirror's surface was grimy and smudged, obscuring any clear reflection. The visitor noticed that the stains on the wallpaper were more pronounced around the mirror, as though the dark substance had been deliberately smeared in that area. The visitor approached the mirror, peering through the grime to catch a glimpse of their own reflection. The dim light of the hallway cast eerie shadows across the visitor's face, and the reflection seemed distorted and fragmented. The dark stains around the mirror appeared to pulse with a faint, unsettling energy, creating an illusion of movement in the glass. As the visitor turned away from the mirror, they noticed a faint, chilling draft that seemed to flow through the corridor. The draft carried with it a faint, haunting whisper, like the echoes of long-forgotten voices. The visitor could not discern the source of the whisper, but it seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house, blending with the dark stains on the wallpaper. The visitor continued down the hallway, their steps echoing in the oppressive silence. The stains on the wallpaper seemed to follow them, the grotesque shapes and figures shifting and changing with each step. The oppressive atmosphere grew heavier, the sense of foreboding intensifying as they moved deeper into the house. The stains on the wallpaper were a testament to the house's dark history, a visual representation of the horrors that had transpired within its walls. The visitor could not escape the feeling that the stains held secrets, dark and malevolent, waiting to be uncovered. The hallway, with its disturbing patterns and unsettling atmosphere, was a reminder of the house's true nature, a place where the past and present intertwined in a never-ending dance of darkness and despair. Chapter 8. The Forgotten Mirror. The visitor found themselves in a dimly lit room, its atmosphere heavy with dust and age. The room was sparsely furnished, the sparse decor consisting of a few old, faded chairs and a large, ornate mirror that dominated the space. The mirror, framed in intricate, tarnished gold, was covered with a thick layer of grime and cobwebs. Its surface was obscured, reflecting little more than a dark, distorted blur. The mirror's frame was adorned with elaborate carvings of twisted figures and abstract patterns, their details lost to the ravages of time. The visitor approached the mirror, their footsteps stirring up clouds of dust that danced in the weak light. As they drew closer, they noticed that the mirror was slightly tilted, its angle shifting ever so slightly as if it were adjusting itself to some unseen force. With careful movements, the visitor reached out to clear the grime from the mirror's surface. Their hand brushed against the frame, dislodging a few cobwebs and revealing patches of tarnished gold beneath. As the grime was wiped away, the mirror's surface began to come into focus, though it remained dark and cloudy. As the visitor continued to clean the mirror, strange symbols and markings began to appear on its surface. The symbols were faint and delicate, etched into the glass itself, their origins unknown. They seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow, and the visitor could not shake the feeling that they were watching, waiting. The mirror's reflection remained dim and unclear, but the visitor noticed that the shadows in the room seemed to shift and elongate, stretching toward the mirror as if drawn by its presence. The room around the mirror appeared to warp and twist, the walls bending and distorting as if viewed through a funhouse lens. The visitor examined the area around the mirror more closely. Behind it, the wall was covered in strange, faded patterns that seemed to echo the symbols on the mirror's surface. The patterns were faint and fragmented, their meanings lost but their presence unsettling. It was as if the mirror and the wall were part of a larger, more complex design, one that was beyond human comprehension. A sudden draft swept through the room, causing the mirror to sway slightly. The movement revealed glimpses of a hidden compartment behind it, a narrow space that seemed to hold something of significance. The visitor's curiosity was piqued, and they carefully adjusted the mirror to investigate further. Behind the mirror was a small alcove, filled with dust-covered objects and faded relics. Among the items was an old, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. The journal was filled with handwritten notes and sketches, but the visitor could not decipher the contents from a distance. The pages seemed to flutter as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Next to the journal lay a collection of small, ornate boxes, their surfaces covered in intricate patterns and strange symbols. The boxes were sealed tightly, their contents a mystery. A single, tarnished key lay atop the boxes, its presence both intriguing and ominous. The visitor's attention was drawn to the mirror's reflection once more. As the mirror's surface cleared, faint images began to emerge, ghostly figures and shadowy shapes that moved with a fluid grace. The figures seemed to interact with one another, their actions forming an unspoken narrative that was both haunting and surreal. The visitor could not help but feel a sense of dread as the images in the mirror grew clearer. The figures appeared to be engaged in some dark ritual or ceremony, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and despair. The mirror's reflection seemed to be a window into a past filled with dark secrets and hidden horrors. The visitor stepped back from the mirror, their heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The room, with its forgotten mirror and enigmatic symbols, held many unanswered questions. The mirror was a key to understanding the house's dark history, a portal to a time and place that had been buried beneath layers of grime and neglect. The visitor knew that the mirror was not just a relic of the past, but a conduit to something far more sinister. The reflection it offered was a glimpse into a world that was both disturbing and mysterious, a world that was waiting to be explored. The forgotten mirror was a reminder that the house's secrets were far from revealed, and that the darkness within was ever present, waiting for those brave enough to seek it out. Chapter 9. The Hidden Passage. The visitor continued their exploration of the house, the sense of dread growing more palpable with each step. They found themselves in a small, dimly lit room on the third floor, its narrow windows barely allowing in any light. The room was filled with dusty furniture and forgotten relics, but it was an inconspicuous panel on one wall that caught the visitor's attention. The panel was slightly different from the rest of the wall, its surface covered in a faded, intricate design that matched the motifs seen throughout the house. The design was subtle, almost imperceptible, blending seamlessly with the wallpaper. A faint, unnatural draft seemed to emanate from behind the panel, as if something was concealed within. The visitor examined the panel closely, noting its peculiar texture and the slight gap at the edges. With careful, deliberate movements, they pressed and tugged at the panel. Their efforts met with slight resistance before it gave way with a low, creaking sound. The panel swung open to reveal a hidden passage, narrow and steep, leading downward into darkness. The passage was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The walls of the passage were lined with old, damp stone, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of mold and grime. The air was heavy and musty, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. As the visitor descended into the passage, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the darkness seemed to grow denser with each step. The walls were adorned with strange markings and symbols, their meanings obscured by the layers of dirt and time. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. The passage opened into a small, subterranean chamber. The chamber was filled with a collection of odd and disturbing artifacts. Ancient tomes with brittle pages, strange trinkets, and a large, rusted iron chest in the center. The chest was bound with heavy chains, and its lock was old and corroded, the metal pitted and worn. The walls of the chamber were covered in faded murals depicting dark rituals and arcane symbols. The murals were detailed and intricate, their scenes filled with figures engaged in mysterious ceremonies. The colors were dark and muted, and the scenes seemed to writhe and shift when viewed from different angles. On a pedestal in the corner of the chamber stood a small, ornate mirror, similar in style to the one previously discovered. The mirror's surface was covered in a thick layer of dust, and its frame was adorned with symbols and figures that matched those on the walls. The mirror's surface was cloudy and distorted, reflecting only a vague, unsettling image. Nearby, a wooden table held a collection of old parchment scrolls and faded, yellowed papers. The scrolls were tightly rolled and bound with string, their contents unreadable from a distance. The papers were scattered haphazardly, their edges frayed and brittle. Among the papers lay a small, leather-bound book with a lock, its cover decorated with dark, intricate designs. The visitor approached the chest with a sense of apprehension. The chains were old and rusted, but the lock was still secure. The visitor examined the chest closely, noting the dark stains that marred its surface. The chest seemed to hum faintly, as if resonating with some hidden energy. The chamber's oppressive atmosphere grew heavier as the visitor moved closer to the chest. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and grow, closing in on the visitor. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and mildew, mingling with the faint, metallic odor that pervaded the house. The visitor's eyes were drawn to the murals on the walls, their dark scenes depicting rituals that were both disturbing and enigmatic. The murals seemed to tell a story of ancient, malevolent forces and forbidden rites, their details hidden in the shadows. The hidden passage and its subterranean chamber were a stark reminder of the house's dark and mysterious past. The chamber held many secrets, and the chest, with its dark stains and hidden contents, was a focal point of the house's malevolent energy. The visitor knew that the passage was not just a physical journey but a descent into the heart of the house's darkness, a place where the boundaries between the past and present were blurred, and where the true horrors of the house awaited discovery. Chapter 10. The Ritual Chamber. The visitor navigated the narrow, winding passage, their footsteps echoing softly against the cold stone walls. The air grew colder and more oppressive as they moved deeper into the house's subterranean depths. The flickering light from their lantern cast long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls, adding to the eerie atmosphere. At the end of the passage, the visitor arrived at a large, arched doorway. The door was heavy and weathered, adorned with intricate carvings of twisted, otherworldly figures and symbols. The carvings depicted scenes of dark rituals and arcane symbols, their meanings obscured by the passage of time. With a sense of trepidation, the visitor pushed open the door, revealing a vast, cavernous chamber beyond. The chamber was dimly lit by a series of flickering torches set into wall sconces, their flames casting an eerie glow on the stone walls. The air was thick with the smell of old incense and something more acrid, as though the chamber had been the site of many dark ceremonies. The center of the chamber was dominated by a large, stone altar. The altar was covered in dark stains and old, dried blood, its surface etched with strange symbols and markings. Surrounding the altar were several large, black candles, their wicks burned down to stubs. The candles had been arranged in a ritualistic pattern, forming a circle around the altar. On the floor, the visitor noticed a series of symbols and diagrams drawn in a mixture of chalk and dark liquid. The symbols were elaborate and arcane, their designs complex and unsettling. The visitor traced the symbols with their eyes, noting how they seemed to pulse faintly with a dark, unnatural energy. To one side of the chamber, a series of shelves lined the wall. The shelves were cluttered with a variety of strange and disturbing artifacts. Jars filled with preserved, grotesque specimens, old, tattered books, and strange, twisted figurines. The artifacts were covered in a thick layer of dust, indicating that they had been untouched for a long time. In the far corner of the chamber, an old, iron-bound door was partially ajar. The door led to a small, dimly lit room beyond, the contents obscured by shadows. The visitor approached the door cautiously, their senses heightened by the oppressive atmosphere of the chamber. Inside the small room, the visitor discovered a collection of ancient, worn manuscripts and scrolls. The manuscripts were bound in old, cracked leather, and the scrolls were tightly rolled and sealed with wax. The visitor noticed that the manuscripts were covered in dense, cryptic text and arcane symbols, their contents shrouded in mystery. A large, ornate book lay open on a pedestal in the center of the room. The book's pages were filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals and forbidden rites. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice and arcane ceremonies, their grotesque details rendered with a chilling accuracy. The visitor's attention was drawn to a small, intricately carved box placed on a nearby table. The box was adorned with dark, swirling patterns and had a small, rusted keyhole in its center. The box seemed to emanate a faint, ominous energy, as if it contained something both precious and malevolent. The visitor carefully examined the chamber and its contents, their sense of dread growing with each passing moment. The chamber, with its dark rituals and arcane symbols, was a testament to the house's hidden history, a place where forbidden knowledge and malevolent forces had once converged. The oppressive atmosphere of the chamber was a stark reminder of the house's true nature. The altar, the symbols, and the artifacts all spoke of a past filled with dark secrets and ancient rites. The visitor knew that they had only scratched the surface of the house's malevolent history, and that the true depth of its darkness remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 11. Echoes of the Past. The visitor retraced their steps through the darkened passages, the weight of the chamber's secrets heavy on their shoulders. The labyrinthine corridors seemed to twist and stretch, each turn leading them deeper into the heart of the house's darkness. The dim light of the lantern flickered erratically, casting long, haunting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. As the visitor navigated through a narrow corridor, they encountered a large, dusty door that appeared out of place among the other more recent architecture. The door was old and weathered, its surface covered in a thick layer of grime and cobwebs. Intricate carvings of disturbing, otherworldly figures adorned the door, their details nearly obscured by the accumulation of dust. The visitor approached the door, their fingers brushing against the cold, rough surface. The door creaked open with a groan, revealing a room shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the musty scent of neglect, and the faintest hint of something more acrid and decayed lingered. Inside, the room was filled with antique furniture covered in white sheets, their outlines barely discernible in the dim light. The furniture was arranged in a seemingly random fashion, as though it had been hastily moved or abandoned. The sheets were stained and discolored, their fabric tattered and worn. The visitor noticed a large, ornate wardrobe standing against one wall. The wardrobe's doors were slightly ajar, revealing a glimpse of the dark, cluttered interior. The visitor approached the wardrobe with caution, their lantern casting a soft light into its depths. Inside the wardrobe, the visitor found an assortment of old clothing and personal items. The clothes were outdated and moth-eaten, their fabrics faded and threadbare. Among the clothes were a collection of old, yellowed letters and photographs, their edges curled and fragile. The photographs depicted scenes of everyday life, but their subjects were distorted and blurred, as though the images had been corrupted by time or some unseen force. The visitor noticed that some of the photographs contained strange, shadowy figures in the background, their presence unsettling and inexplicable. The letters, written in a shaky, elegant script, were filled with cryptic messages and references to dark, esoteric knowledge. The visitor could not fully decipher the contents, but the letters spoke of hidden knowledge, ancient rites, and a sense of growing dread. In the corner of the room, a large, dust-covered mirror stood against the wall. The mirror's surface was clouded and grimy, reflecting only a vague, distorted image of the room. The visitor wiped away some of the grime, revealing a slightly clearer reflection. The mirror's frame was adorned with dark, intricate carvings, their details worn and faded. As the visitor examined the mirror, they noticed that the reflections seemed to shift and change, creating an unsettling sense of movement. The figures in the reflections appeared distorted and ghostly, their features twisted and unrecognizable. The reflections seemed to mimic the visitor's movements, but with an eerie, unnatural quality. A sudden chill swept through the room, causing the visitor to shiver. The temperature dropped sharply, and the faint whisper of a breeze seemed to carry distant, indistinguishable voices. The visitor's breath formed small clouds of mist in the cold air, adding to the room's oppressive atmosphere. The visitor's gaze was drawn to a series of small, dust-covered objects on a nearby table. The objects were strange and unsettling. A collection of old, tarnished jewelry, a set of faded, cracked porcelain figurines, and a small, ornate box. The box was intricately carved, its surface covered in strange symbols and patterns. The visitor carefully opened the box, revealing a collection of old, yellowed documents and a small, rusted key. The documents were covered in faded handwriting and arcane symbols, their contents indecipherable but clearly important. The key was small and ornate, its surface engraved with intricate designs. The room, with its dust-covered furniture and unsettling reflections, was a testament to the house's dark and mysterious past. The echoes of the past seemed to linger in the air, a reminder of the secrets and horrors that had once inhabited these walls. The visitor knew that each discovery only deepened the enigma of the house, and that the true nature of its darkness remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 12: The Phantom Shadows. The visitor, feeling the weight of their discoveries, moved cautiously through a narrow, winding corridor. The air grew colder with each step, and the dim light from the lantern flickered ominously, casting wavering shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The corridor ended at a heavy, iron-bound door, its surface etched with strange, abstract symbols that matched those found throughout the house. The door was old and weathered, its edges covered in rust and grime. A faint, eerie glow emanated from beneath the door, casting an unsettling light on the floor. The visitor hesitated before pushing open the door, revealing a large, dimly lit room. The room was vast and cavernous, its walls lined with old, dusty bookshelves and cluttered with various artifacts and relics. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and decaying wood. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate pedestal, upon which rested an old, weathered book. The book was bound in cracked leather, its cover adorned with intricate, dark symbols. The book seemed to emanate a faint, pulsating glow, as if it held some dark power within. The visitor approached the pedestal, their footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness of the room. As they drew closer, they noticed that the book was open to a page filled with detailed illustrations of arcane rituals and occult symbols. The illustrations were dark and foreboding, depicting scenes of forbidden rites and shadowy figures. Around the pedestal, the visitor noticed several large, shadowy figures moving with a fluid, ghostly grace. The figures seemed to drift and shift, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows that clung to the walls. The visitor could not discern their features, but their presence was both chilling and unnerving. The shadows moved in a slow, deliberate manner, as if performing some unseen, ritualistic dance. Their movements were synchronized with the flickering light of the lantern, creating an eerie, almost hypnotic effect. The figures seemed to interact with one another, their actions forming an unspoken, unsettling narrative. The visitor's gaze was drawn to the walls, which were covered in faded murals depicting scenes of dark rituals and ancient ceremonies. The murals were intricate and detailed, their colors muted and worn. The scenes depicted figures engaged in strange, otherworldly rites, their expressions twisted in agony and despair. As the visitor moved closer to the book, the shadows around the pedestal grew more defined, their shapes becoming more distinct and menacing. The figures seemed to close in on the visitor, their movements synchronized with the rhythmic pulsing of the book's glow. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, causing the shadows to flicker and distort. The room's atmosphere grew heavier, and the faint whispers of an unseen presence seemed to echo through the darkness. The visitor felt a shiver run down their spine as the whispers grew louder, their content indistinguishable but filled with an unsettling, malevolent tone. The visitor's eyes were drawn back to the book, its pages filled with detailed, disturbing illustrations. The book seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its glow growing more intense and erratic. The visitor reached out to touch the book, their fingers trembling as they brushed against the weathered leather. As the visitor's hand made contact with the book, the shadows in the room seemed to coalesce into a single, dark mass. The figures moved with an increased urgency, their forms twisting and writhing as if trying to escape the confines of the shadows. The atmosphere grew even colder, and the whispers grew more insistent, their tone filled with a sense of foreboding. The visitor quickly withdrew their hand, stepping back from the pedestal. The shadows around the room seemed to recede, their presence fading as the book's glow dimmed. The whispers ceased, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. The visitor surveyed the room once more, their heart pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. The shadows and whispers had been a reminder of the house's dark and malevolent energy, a force that seemed to lurk just beyond the edges of perception. The book, with its dark power and unsettling illustrations, was a focal point of the house's hidden horrors, a testament to the ancient and forbidden knowledge that lay at the heart of its darkness. Chapter 13. The Ritual of Shadows. The visitor, deeply unsettled by their previous encounter, proceeded with heightened caution through a narrow, dimly lit passage. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing increasingly stale and suffocating. The flickering light of the lantern cast erratic shadows that danced across the walls, heightening the sense of unease. At the end of the passage, the visitor arrived at an arched doorway adorned with faded, ornate carvings. The carvings depicted eerie, twisted figures and arcane symbols, their details lost to the ravages of time. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Pushing the door open, the visitor entered a large, circular chamber. The chamber was dimly lit by an array of black candles arranged in a complex pattern on the floor. The candles were lit, their flames casting a soft, flickering light that barely penetrated the room's oppressive darkness. In the center of the chamber was a large, stone altar covered in dark, dried stains. The altar was surrounded by a series of concentric circles drawn in a mixture of dark chalk and what appeared to be old blood. The circles were filled with intricate symbols and patterns, their meanings obscured but clearly ritualistic in nature. Around the edges of the chamber, tall, iron sconces held an assortment of strange, arcane objects, old tomes, ceremonial daggers, and bizarre, twisted artifacts. The objects were arranged meticulously, their purpose unknown but their presence undeniably sinister. The visitor approached the altar with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. On the altar lay an ancient, open manuscript. The manuscript was filled with dense, cryptic text and illustrations of dark rites. The illustrations depicted shadowy figures engaged in disturbing rituals, their faces twisted in expressions of torment and malevolence. Next to the manuscript was a collection of small, glass vials filled with dark, viscous liquid. The vials were arranged in a precise order, their contents glinting faintly in the candlelight. A small, ornate knife lay beside the vials, its blade covered in what appeared to be dried blood. The visitor's attention was drawn to a series of large, arcane symbols etched into the floor around the altar. The symbols were intricate and detailed, their designs forming a complex pattern that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy. The visitor could not decipher the symbols, but could feel their oppressive weight. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the chamber, causing the candles to flicker and the shadows to shift. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew heavy with an unsettling sense of foreboding. The visitor's breath formed small clouds of mist, and a faint whisper seemed to echo through the chamber, its source indistinguishable. The visitor carefully examined the symbols on the floor, noting how they seemed to change and shift as the shadows danced across them. The symbols appeared to form a ritualistic pattern, their meanings hidden but their presence undeniably disturbing. The visitor noticed a hidden alcove in the chamber's far wall. The alcove was partially concealed by heavy, dark curtains that had been drawn back slightly. The visitor approached the alcove, their lantern casting a dim light onto its contents. Inside the alcove, the visitor discovered a large, ornate chest bound with heavy chains. The chest was covered in dark, rusted locks and had an air of malevolent significance. The visitor noticed that the chest was inscribed with the same arcane symbols found on the floor and around the chamber. The visitor's fingers traced the symbols on the chest's surface, feeling the cold metal beneath their touch. The chest seemed to hum with a dark energy, its presence both foreboding and enticing. The visitor could not help but feel that the chest held some hidden, terrible secret. With a deep breath, the visitor took a step back from the chest and surveyed the chamber once more. The patterns and symbols, the flickering candlelight, and the dark rituals all combined to create an atmosphere of profound dread and mystery. The chamber was a focal point of the house's dark history, a place where forbidden rites and ancient knowledge had once converged. The visitor knew that they had uncovered only a fraction of the house's malevolent secrets. The chamber, with its ritualistic symbols and unsettling artifacts, was a reminder of the dark forces that lurked just beyond the veil of perception. The true nature of the house's darkness remained hidden, waiting for those brave enough to seek it out and confront the shadows that lay within. Chapter 14. The Forgotten Ritual. The visitor left the Chamber of Shadows, their mind heavy with the weight of the disturbing discoveries. Moving through the dimly lit corridors, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the house itself was closing in around them. Each step echoed through the silence, the oppressive atmosphere pressing in from all sides. The passageways seemed to twist and turn endlessly, the walls lined with faded, peeling wallpaper and old, dusty portraits. The portraits depicted stern-faced individuals whose eyes seemed to follow the visitor's every movement. The visitor could not shake the feeling that the eyes were filled with silent judgment, their gaze penetrating and unsettling. At the end of a particularly narrow corridor, the visitor discovered a heavy wooden door. adorned with intricate carvings that matched those seen in the earlier chambers. The door was slightly ajar, and the visitor could see a faint, eerie light spilling through the gap. Pushing the door open, the visitor stepped into a large, vaulted room. The room was dimly illuminated by the flickering light of several oil lamps placed around the perimeter. The light cast long, flickering shadows on the stone walls, creating an unsettling atmosphere. In the center of the room stood a large, circular stone platform covered in a thick layer of dust. The platform was surrounded by a series of old, weathered statues, each one depicting a grotesque, otherworldly figure. The statues were covered in moss and grime, their features twisted into expressions of agony and malevolence. Atop the stone platform was a collection of ancient ritual objects, an ornate dagger with a handle encrusted with dark, precious stones, a large, weathered book bound in cracked leather, and a set of intricately carved wooden masks. The masks were adorned with dark, swirling patterns and had an air of malevolence about them. The visitor approached the stone platform with a sense of trepidation. The large book on the platform was open to a page filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice and forbidden rites, the figures rendered with an unsettling level of detail. The visitor's gaze was drawn to the wooden masks. Each mask was intricately carved and seemed to radiate a dark, malevolent energy. The masks were arranged in a precise pattern around the platform, their eyes seeming to watch the visitor with an unsettling intensity. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, causing the oil lamps to flicker and the shadows to dance wildly. The temperature dropped sharply, and the visitor felt an icy chill that made their breath mist in the air. The atmosphere grew heavier, filled with an almost tangible sense of foreboding. The visitor noticed that the statues surrounding the platform seemed to shift slightly in the flickering light, their grotesque faces contorting into expressions of silent agony. The shadows cast by the statues seemed to stretch and writhe, creating an eerie and disorienting effect. As the visitor moved closer to the platform, they felt a faint, rhythmic vibration beneath their feet. The vibration seemed to emanate from the stone platform itself, as if it were a focal point for some dark, unseen force. The visitor could not determine the source of the vibration, but could sense that it was connected to the ritualistic objects on the platform. The visitor carefully examined the ritual objects, noting the dark, intricate designs etched into the surfaces of the dagger and the book. The designs matched those found in the earlier chambers, creating a sense of continuity and connection throughout the house. The book's pages were filled with dense, cryptic text and illustrations of forbidden rites. The visitor's eyes were drawn to the masks once more. The masks seemed to hold a dark, oppressive energy, as if they were imbued with the essence of the rituals they had witnessed. The visitor could not shake the feeling that the masks were somehow connected to the dark forces that permeated the house. With a sense of growing unease, the visitor stepped back from the stone platform and surveyed the room. The statues, the ritual objects, and the flickering shadows all combined to create an atmosphere of profound dread and mystery. The room was a testament to the house's dark history, a place where forbidden rituals and ancient knowledge had once converged. The visitor knew that the true nature of the house's darkness remained hidden, waiting for those brave enough to seek it out. The forgotten ritual and its accompanying artifacts were a reminder of the malevolent forces that lay in wait, ready to be uncovered by those who dared to confront the shadows that lurked within. Chapter 15. The Depths of Despair. The visitor, now deeply unsettled, wandered through a narrow, winding staircase that descended further into the bowels of the house. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step, and the flickering lantern cast eerie shadows on the walls. The faint sound of dripping water echoed through the dark, confined space. At the bottom of the staircase, the visitor arrived at a heavy, iron door. The door was ancient and rusted, its surface etched with faded, cryptic symbols. A faint, otherworldly light seeped through the cracks around the door, casting an unsettling glow on the floor. Pushing open the door, the visitor entered a vast, cavernous chamber. The chamber was illuminated by a dim, eerie light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The walls were covered in a thick layer of dark, slimy substance, and the air was heavy with the smell of decay and rot. In the center of the chamber was a large, circular pit, its edges lined with strange, pulsating symbols. The pit was filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to writhe and shift as if alive. The liquid emitted a faint, malevolent glow, casting an eerie light across the chamber. Surrounding the pit were several large, weathered statues, each one depicting grotesque, twisted figures. The statues were covered in a thick layer of grime and slime, their features obscured but their expressions clearly filled with torment and despair. The statues seemed to watch over the pit with a malevolent, unseeing gaze. The visitor approached the edge of the pit with a sense of foreboding. The liquid within the pit was dark and opaque, its surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple. The visitor could feel a faint, pulsing energy emanating from the pit, an almost tangible sense of malevolence. Beside the pit, the visitor discovered a series of old, rotting wooden shelves. The shelves were cluttered with a variety of disturbing artifacts, jars filled with preserved specimens, ancient, tattered tomes, and twisted, grotesque figurines. The artifacts were covered in a thick layer of dust and slime, indicating that they had been untouched for a long time. On one of the shelves, the visitor found a large, ornate book bound in cracked leather. The book was open to a page filled with disturbing illustrations and cryptic text. The illustrations depicted scenes of dark rituals and forbidden rites, their details rendered with a chilling accuracy. The visitor's attention was drawn to a small, intricately carved box placed on a nearby table. The box was adorned with dark, swirling patterns and had a small, rusted keyhole in its center. The box seemed to emanate a faint, ominous energy, as if it contained something both precious and malevolent. With a sense of trepidation, the visitor picked up the box and examined it closely. The carvings on the surface of the box matched those found on the artifacts and symbols throughout the house. The keyhole was small and rusted, indicating that the box had not been opened in many years. As the visitor turned the box over in their hands, they noticed a faint, rhythmic vibration emanating from within. The vibration was subtle but persistent, as if something inside the box was trying to escape. The visitor could not determine the source of the vibration, but felt a growing sense of unease. The visitor carefully placed the box back on the table and stepped back, surveying the chamber once more. The pit, the statues, and the artifacts all combined to create an atmosphere of profound dread and despair. The chamber was a testament to the house's dark and malevolent history, a place where forbidden knowledge and ancient rites had once converged. The visitor knew that they had uncovered only a fraction of the house's hidden secrets. The chamber, with its dark liquid pit and disturbing artifacts, was a reminder of the malevolent forces that lurked just beyond the edges of perception. The true nature of the house's darkness remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered by those brave enough to confront the shadows that lay within. Chapter 16. The Veil of Nightmares. The visitor, their mind weighed down by the ominous discoveries, continued their exploration of the house's dark depths. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence as they navigated through a narrow, winding corridor. The walls were lined with dark, ornate tapestries depicting scenes of ancient, nightmarish landscapes. At the end of the corridor, the visitor arrived at a heavy wooden door, its surface covered in intricate carvings of twisted, nightmarish figures. The carvings seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light, creating an unsettling effect. A faint, eerie glow seeped through the cracks around the door. Pushing the door open, the visitor stepped into a large, circular room. The room was shrouded in darkness, with only a faint, eerie light coming from a central, hanging chandelier covered in cobwebs. The chandelier's light cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, creating a sense of disorientation. In the center of the room stood a large, circular mirror with an ornate, dark frame. The mirror was covered in a thick layer of grime, its surface obscured and murky. The reflection in the mirror was distorted and unsettling, showing twisted, shadowy shapes that seemed to move and shift. Around the mirror were several tall, ancient cabinets filled with strange, disturbing items. The cabinets were cluttered with a variety of oddities. Old, cracked porcelain dolls with empty, hollow eyes, jars filled with preserved specimens, and twisted, grotesque figurines. The items were covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The visitor approached the mirror with a sense of trepidation. As they drew closer, the reflection in the mirror seemed to change, showing fleeting glimpses of distorted, nightmarish visions. The shapes in the reflection appeared to writhe and twist, creating an unsettling and disorienting effect. The visitor's gaze was drawn to the large, ornate frame of the mirror. The frame was covered in intricate carvings of dark, swirling patterns and eerie figures. The carvings seemed to shift and change in the flickering light, creating an effect that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Nearby, the visitor noticed a collection of old, tattered books scattered across a large, dust-covered table. The books were filled with dense, cryptic text and disturbing illustrations. The illustrations depicted scenes of dark rituals, forbidden rites, and nightmarish creatures. Among the books was a large, leather-bound tome with a dark, pulsating aura. The tome was open to a page filled with illustrations of disturbing, otherworldly beings and arcane symbols. The illustrations were rendered with a chilling accuracy, showing nightmarish creatures and twisted, surreal landscapes. The visitor felt a sudden, icy chill as the temperature in the room dropped sharply. The cold air seemed to seep into their bones, creating an overwhelming sense of dread. The flickering light of the chandelier cast eerie, shifting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe across the walls. A series of strange, rhythmic noises echoed through the room, coming from the dark corners and hidden recesses. The noises were faint and indistinct, creating an unsettling feeling of being watched. The visitor could not determine the source of the noises, but their presence added to the room's oppressive atmosphere. The visitor noticed a small, ornate box on a nearby shelf. The box was intricately carved and seemed to radiate a dark, malevolent energy. The carvings on the box matched those found on the mirror's frame and the items in the cabinets. The visitor approached the box, feeling a sense of foreboding. Opening the box carefully, the visitor discovered a collection of old, yellowed documents and a small, ornate key. The documents were covered in cryptic text and disturbing illustrations, their contents indecipherable but clearly important. The key was small and intricately designed, its surface engraved with dark, swirling patterns. The visitor closed the box and stepped back, surveying the room once more. The mirror, the strange items, and the disturbing books all combined to create an atmosphere of profound dread and nightmare. The room was a testament to the house's dark and malevolent history, a place where forbidden knowledge and nightmarish visions had once converged. The visitor knew that the true nature of the house's darkness remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered. The mirror, with its twisted reflections and dark aura, was a reminder of the malevolent forces that lay just beyond the veil of perception. The visitor's journey through the house was far from over, and the shadows that lurked within were waiting to reveal their deepest secrets. Chapter 17. The Hidden Passage. The visitor, their sense of dread mounting with each discovery, left the room of nightmares behind and continued their exploration. The narrow corridor beyond the door was even darker, the walls covered in old, cracked plaster that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy. As they moved forward, the corridor grew colder, and a faint, echoing sound of dripping water became more pronounced. The visitor's lantern flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. The oppressive atmosphere made each step feel like an arduous effort. At the end of the corridor, the visitor encountered another heavy, iron door. The door was aged and rusted, its surface covered in strange, occult symbols similar to those found elsewhere in the house. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, their light casting eerie reflections on the floor. Pushing open the door, the visitor stepped into a narrow, dimly lit chamber. The chamber was small and sparsely furnished, with a single, dusty wooden table in the center. On the table lay an assortment of old, tattered maps and blueprints, their edges worn and frayed. The visitor approached the table with curiosity, carefully examining the maps and blueprints. The documents were covered in intricate drawings of the house's layout, including several hidden rooms and secret passages. The maps were marked with cryptic symbols and annotations, indicating areas of interest and hidden dangers. Among the documents was a large, aged parchment depicting a detailed layout of the house. The parchment showed a complex network of corridors and chambers, with several passages marked in red ink. One of the passages seemed to lead to a hidden room, its location indicated by a series of dark, swirling symbols. The visitor's attention was drawn to a large, ornate mirror hanging on one wall. The mirror's frame was covered in intricate carvings, and its surface was obscured by a thick layer of dust. The mirror seemed to emit a faint, eerie glow, casting distorted reflections on the walls. Upon closer inspection, the visitor noticed a faint, hidden lever concealed within the mirror's frame. The lever was small and unobtrusive, nearly blending in with the intricate carvings. With a sense of growing anticipation, the visitor pulled the lever, triggering a mechanism within the wall. A section of the wall opposite the mirror slowly began to shift and slide open, revealing a hidden passage. The passage was narrow and dark, its entrance obscured by cobwebs and dust. The visitor could feel a cold, damp breeze emanating from within, carrying with it an unsettling sense of foreboding. The visitor carefully stepped into the hidden passage, their lantern casting a dim light that barely penetrated the darkness. The passage was lined with old, wooden beams and covered in thick layers of grime. The air was heavy with the smell of decay and rot, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the narrow space. As the visitor progressed through the passage, they noticed that the walls were covered in strange, arcane symbols and cryptic markings. The symbols were similar to those found throughout the house, creating a sense of continuity and connection with the house's dark history. The passage seemed to twist and turn endlessly, its path leading deeper into the heart of the house. The visitor felt a growing sense of unease, as if the passage was drawing them further into the depths of the house's malevolent secrets. After what felt like an eternity, the passage emerged into a large, dimly lit chamber. The chamber was vast and cavernous, with high, arched ceilings and walls covered in dark, ancient tapestries. The tapestries depicted disturbing scenes of ancient rituals and nightmarish creatures, their colors muted and faded. In the center of the chamber stood an old, weathered altar covered in dark, dried stains. The altar was surrounded by a series of large, ancient statues, each one depicting grotesque, otherworldly figures. The statues were covered in a thick layer of grime and cobwebs, their expressions twisted into forms of silent torment. The visitor approached the altar with a sense of dread. On the altar lay an assortment of old, arcane artifacts. A large, intricately carved book, a set of strange, ritualistic tools, and a collection of dark, twisted relics. The artifacts were covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, indicating that they had been untouched for a long time. The visitor's gaze was drawn to the large, ornate book resting on the altar. The book was bound in cracked leather and covered in intricate, dark symbols. Its pages were filled with cryptic text and disturbing illustrations of forbidden rites and ancient rituals. The chamber was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread and malevolence. The hidden passage had led to a place of profound darkness, where the house's deepest secrets and most forbidden knowledge lay hidden. The visitor knew that they were now closer than ever to uncovering the full extent of the house's malevolent history and the shadows that lurked within. Chapter 18. The Relic of Shadows. The visitor, feeling the oppressive weight of the chamber's darkness, approached the altar with a mixture of fear and determination. The air was thick with the musty scent of decay, and the dim light from their lantern barely penetrated the shadowy depths of the room. The visitor examined the artifacts laid out on the altar. The large, ornate book was bound in cracked leather and covered in dark, intricate symbols. Its pages were filled with dense, cryptic text and disturbing illustrations of ancient rites and forbidden knowledge. The book seemed to radiate a dark, pulsating energy. Beside the book was a set of strange, ritualistic tools. A silver chalice encrusted with dark, precious stones, an ornate dagger with a handle wrapped in faded leather, and a collection of small, intricately carved amulets. The tools were covered in a layer of dust and grime, indicating their long abandonment. The visitor's attention was drawn to the amulets. Each amulet was crafted from dark, polished stone and inscribed with arcane symbols. The symbols matched those found throughout the house, suggesting a connection between the artifacts and the house's dark history. The amulets seemed to hum with a faint, malevolent energy. The visitor picked up one of the amulets, feeling its weight and texture. The amulet was cold and smooth to the touch, its surface engraved with swirling, intricate patterns. As the visitor held the amulet, a sudden, icy chill swept through the chamber, causing their breath to mist in the air. The visitor noticed a series of large, dark tapestries hanging on the chamber's walls. The tapestries depicted disturbing scenes of ancient rituals and nightmarish creatures, their colors muted and faded. The figures in the tapestries seemed to writhe and twist, creating a disorienting and unsettling effect. In the corner of the chamber stood a large, ancient chest bound with rusted iron chains. The chest was covered in dark, arcane symbols, and its surface was obscured by a thick layer of grime. The chest seemed to radiate a dark, oppressive energy, as if it contained some hidden, malevolent secret. The visitor approached the chest with a sense of foreboding. The iron chains were old and rusted, their surface covered in dark, corrosive stains. The chest locks were large and intricate, their design matching the symbols found on the other artifacts in the chamber. With a deep breath, the visitor carefully examined the chest locks. The locks were complex and ornate, their mechanisms hidden beneath layers of rust and grime. The visitor could not discern the exact nature of the locks, but felt a growing sense of anticipation and dread. The visitor's gaze shifted back to the large book on the altar. The book's pages were filled with detailed illustrations of forbidden rites and dark rituals. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice, occult ceremonies, and ancient deities, their details rendered with a chilling accuracy. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the chamber, causing the lantern's light to flicker and the shadows to dance erratically. The temperature dropped sharply, and the visitor felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air grew heavy with a palpable sense of malevolence, as if the chamber itself was alive with dark, unseen forces. The visitor carefully placed the amulet back on the altar and stepped back, surveying the chamber once more. The artifacts, the tapestries, and the dark chest all combined to create an atmosphere of profound dread and mystery. The chamber was a focal point of the house's dark history, a place where forbidden knowledge and ancient rites had once converged. As the visitor turned to leave, their lantern cast a final, flickering light on the chest and its dark, arcane symbols. The chest stood as a testament to the house's malevolent past, a hidden repository of secrets and darkness waiting to be uncovered. The visitor knew that their journey through the house was far from over. The relics and symbols in the chamber hinted at deeper, more sinister forces lurking just beyond the veil of perception. The true nature of the house's darkness remained hidden, waiting to be revealed by those who dared to confront the shadows that lay within. Chapter 19. The Ritual Chamber. The visitor emerged from the hidden passage into a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The walls were covered in old, dark wallpaper, peeling and stained with age. The flickering light from the lantern cast long, distorted shadows, creating an eerie atmosphere. The air was cool and musty, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. At the end of the hallway, the visitor came upon a heavy, iron door. The door was marked with faded, ancient symbols and covered in a thick layer of dust. The symbols were similar to those found throughout the house, suggesting a connection to the house's dark history. A faint, unsettling glow seeped through the cracks around the door. With a deep breath, the visitor pushed the door open and stepped into a vast, circular chamber. The chamber was dimly illuminated by a series of flickering torches mounted on the walls. The torches cast an eerie, shifting light, creating an unsettling effect as their flames danced and flickered. In the center of the chamber stood a large, circular stone platform. The platform was covered in intricate carvings and dark stains, suggesting it had been used for some dark and forbidden purpose. The carvings depicted scenes of ancient rituals and nightmarish beings, their details rendered with a chilling accuracy. Around the platform were several large, weathered statues, each one depicting grotesque, otherworldly figures. The statues were covered in grime and dust, their expressions twisted into forms of silent agony. The statues seemed to watch over the platform with a malevolent, unseeing gaze. The visitor approached the platform with a sense of dread. On the platform were several ancient ritual objects: a large, ornate chalice, a collection of dark, twisted relics, and a series of strange, ritualistic tools. The objects were covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, indicating their long abandonment. Beside the platform was an old, weathered book bound in cracked leather. The book was open to a page filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals and forbidden rites. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice, occult ceremonies, and ancient deities, their details rendered with a chilling accuracy. The visitor's gaze was drawn to a set of dark, twisted relics placed in a precise pattern around the platform. The relics were intricately carved and seemed to radiate a dark, malevolent energy. The carvings on the relics matched those found on the platform and the statues, suggesting a connection between the objects and the house's dark history. In one corner of the chamber stood a large, ancient chest bound with rusted iron chains. The chest was covered in dark, arcane symbols and had a small, rusted keyhole in its center. The chest seemed to emit a faint, ominous energy, as if it contained some hidden, malevolent secret. The visitor approached the chest with a sense of trepidation. The iron chains were old and corroded, their surface covered in dark, corrosive stains. The keyhole was small and rusted, indicating that the chest had not been opened in many years. The visitor carefully examined the chest locks and noticed that they matched the design of the symbols found on the other artifacts in the chamber. The intricate design of the locks suggested that they were tied to the chamber's dark and forbidden rituals. As the visitor stepped back from the chest, they noticed a faint, rhythmic vibration emanating from within. The vibration was subtle but persistent, creating an unsettling feeling of anticipation and dread. The visitor could not determine the source of the vibration, but felt that it was connected to the hidden secrets of the chamber. The visitor carefully surveyed the chamber once more. The stone platform, the ritual objects, the statues, and the dark chest all combined to create an atmosphere of profound dread and mystery. The chamber was a focal point of the house's dark history, a place where forbidden knowledge and ancient rites had once converged. The visitor knew that they had uncovered only a fraction of the house's hidden secrets. The chamber, with its dark, ritualistic artifacts and ominous chest, was a reminder of the malevolent forces that lay just beyond the edges of perception. The true nature of the house's darkness remained hidden, waiting to be revealed by those who dared to confront the shadows that lay within. Chapter 20. The Whispering Darkness. The visitor, their sense of foreboding growing with each step, left the ritual chamber and ventured into another darkened hallway. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it an unsettling silence. The walls were lined with old, cracked mirrors that reflected distorted, ghostly images in the dim light of the lantern. As the visitor proceeded, they noticed that the mirrors were covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. The reflections they cast were warped and fragmented, creating an eerie, disorienting effect. The visitor could see flickers of shadowy figures moving within the reflections, though their source was unclear. At the end of the hallway, the visitor arrived at a large, heavy door made of dark, ancient wood. The door was adorned with intricate carvings of nightmarish figures and symbols, its surface weathered and aged. A faint, unsettling glow seeped through the cracks around the door. With a sense of trepidation, the visitor pushed open the door and stepped into a cavernous, dimly lit chamber. The chamber was vast and filled with an oppressive darkness, its high ceilings lost in shadow. The only source of light was a series of flickering, hanging lanterns, their flames casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. In the center of the chamber was a large, circular pit. The pit was filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to writhe and shift as if alive. The liquid emitted a faint, malevolent glow, casting an eerie light across the chamber. The pit's edges were lined with strange, pulsating symbols that seemed to change and shift in the flickering light. Surrounding the pit were several large, ancient statues, each depicting grotesque, otherworldly figures. The statues were covered in grime and cobwebs, their expressions twisted into forms of silent torment. The statues seemed to watch over the pit with a malevolent, unseeing gaze. The visitor approached the pit with a sense of dread. The liquid within the pit was dark and opaque, its surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple. The visitor could feel a faint, pulsing energy emanating from the pit, an almost tangible sense of malevolence. Nearby, the visitor discovered a series of old, weathered shelves filled with an assortment of disturbing artifacts. The shelves were cluttered with jars containing preserved specimens, ancient tomes bound in cracked leather, and twisted, grotesque figurines. The artifacts were covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, indicating their long abandonment. On one of the shelves, the visitor found a large, ornate book bound in cracked leather. The book was open to a page filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals and forbidden rites. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice and occult ceremonies, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. The visitor's attention was drawn to a small, intricately carved box placed on a nearby table. The box was adorned with dark, swirling patterns and had a small, rusted keyhole in its center. The box seemed to radiate a faint, ominous energy, as if it contained something both precious and malevolent. As the visitor examined the box, they noticed a faint, rhythmic whisper emanating from within. The whisper was subtle but persistent, creating an unsettling feeling of being watched. The visitor could not discern the source of the whisper, but felt that it was connected to the hidden secrets of the chamber. The visitor carefully picked up the box and examined it closely. The carvings on the surface of the box matched those found on the artifacts and symbols throughout the chamber. The keyhole was small and rusted, indicating that the box had not been opened in many years. With a sense of growing unease, the visitor set the box back on the table and stepped back. The chamber, with its dark liquid pit, eerie artifacts, and ominous box, created an atmosphere of profound dread and malevolence. The whispers seemed to grow louder and more insistent, filling the chamber with an oppressive sense of foreboding. The visitor knew that they had uncovered only a fraction of the house's hidden secrets. The chamber, with its whispering darkness and malevolent energy, was a reminder of the powerful forces that lay hidden within the house's shadows. The true nature of the house's darkness remained concealed, waiting to be revealed by those who dared to confront the whispers that lay within. Chapter 21. The Mirror's Secret. The visitor left the chamber of the whispering darkness, their nerves frayed by the oppressive atmosphere and unsettling whispers. They wandered through a narrow, winding corridor, its walls lined with faded, dark wallpaper and adorned with old, tarnished portraits. The portraits depicted somber, enigmatic figures in various states of distress and agony. The faces in the portraits seemed to follow the visitor's every move, their eyes glinting with a malevolent light. The portraits were covered in a thick layer of dust, their colors faded and muted. At the end of the corridor, the visitor discovered a large, ornate door, its surface covered in dark, swirling patterns and ancient symbols. The door's carvings matched those found in the other parts of the house, suggesting a connection to the house's dark history. A faint, eerie glow seeped through the cracks around the door. With a deep breath, the visitor pushed open the door and stepped into a grand, dimly lit room. The room was expansive, with high, arched ceilings and walls lined with dark, velvet drapes. The air was heavy with dust and the scent of old, forgotten memories. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror with a gilded, intricately carved frame. The mirror's surface was obscured by a thick layer of grime, but the faint glow from the surrounding torches cast eerie reflections on its surface. The mirror seemed to radiate a dark, malevolent energy. The visitor approached the mirror with a sense of trepidation. The carvings on the mirror's frame depicted twisted, nightmarish figures and arcane symbols, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. The carvings seemed to shift and change in the flickering light, creating a disorienting effect. As the visitor examined the mirror, they noticed that the reflection in the glass was distorted and fragmented. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple and warp, casting unsettling, ghostly images. The visitor could see fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures moving within the reflections, though their source remained unclear. The visitor's gaze was drawn to a small, hidden compartment concealed within the base of the mirror's frame. The compartment was covered in intricate carvings and had a small, rusted keyhole. The carvings on the compartment matched those found on the mirror and other artifacts throughout the house. With a sense of growing anticipation, the visitor carefully examined the keyhole. The keyhole was small and rusted, indicating that the compartment had not been accessed in many years. The visitor reached into their pocket and retrieved the small, ornate key they had found earlier. Inserting the key into the keyhole, the visitor turned it slowly. The mechanism within the compartment clicked, and the small panel swung open to reveal a hidden drawer. The drawer was filled with old, yellowed documents and a small, dark box. The visitor pulled out the documents and carefully examined them. The documents were covered in dense, cryptic text and disturbing illustrations. The illustrations depicted scenes of dark rituals, forbidden rites, and ancient deities. The text was indecipherable but clearly significant. The visitor's attention was drawn to the small, dark box resting at the bottom of the drawer. The box was intricately carved and radiated a faint, malevolent energy. The carvings on the box matched those found on the mirror's frame and other artifacts. With a sense of trepidation, the visitor carefully opened the box. Inside, they found a collection of dark, twisted relics and a small, ornate amulet. The relics were intricately carved and seemed to radiate a dark, pulsating energy. The amulet was crafted from dark, polished stone and inscribed with arcane symbols. As the visitor examined the amulet, they felt a sudden, icy chill sweep through the room. The temperature dropped sharply, and the flickering light from the torches cast eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. The visitor could sense an overwhelming presence, as if the mirror itself was watching them. The visitor set the box and documents aside and took a final look at the mirror. The distorted reflections seemed to ripple and shift, casting unsettling images on the walls. The mirror was a focal point of the house's dark history, a conduit to the malevolent forces that lurked just beyond the edges of perception. With a sense of profound unease, the visitor turned to leave the room. The mirror's secret, though uncovered, only deepened the mystery of the house's darkness. The true nature of the house's malevolent history remained hidden, waiting to be revealed by those who dared to confront the shadows that lay within. Chapter 22. The Vault of Shadows. Leaving the grand room with the mirror, the visitor descended a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into the depths of the house. The steps were old and worn, their edges covered in layers of dust and grime. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, carrying an unsettling silence that seemed to press in on all sides. At the bottom of the staircase, the visitor reached a heavy, iron door. The door was massive and aged, adorned with dark, swirling symbols and intricate carvings. The symbols glowed faintly in the dim light of the lantern, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The visitor pushed open the door and entered a large, cavernous chamber. The room was vast and filled with an oppressive darkness, its high ceilings lost in shadow. The only source of light was a series of flickering torches mounted on the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted. In the center of the chamber stood a massive stone vault, its surface covered in dark, pulsating symbols. The vault was secured with an elaborate, ornate lock and a series of heavy, rusted chains. The chains were bound tightly around the vault, their surfaces covered in dark, corrosive stains. The visitor approached the vault with a sense of trepidation. The symbols on the vault were similar to those found throughout the house, suggesting a connection to the house's dark history. The lock was intricate and complex, its design matching the symbols and artifacts found elsewhere in the house. Nearby, the visitor noticed a large, weathered pedestal with an assortment of strange, ritualistic objects. The pedestal was cluttered with dark, twisted relics, ancient tomes bound in cracked leather, and small, intricately carved amulets. The objects were covered in a thick layer of dust, indicating their long abandonment. On the pedestal, the visitor found an ancient tome bound in dark, cracked leather. The book was open to a page filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals and forbidden rites. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice and occult ceremonies, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. The visitor's attention was drawn to a small, ornate box resting on the pedestal. The box was covered in intricate carvings and had a small, rusted keyhole. The carvings on the box matched those found on the vault and other artifacts throughout the chamber. With a sense of growing anticipation, the visitor carefully examined the keyhole. The keyhole was small and rusted, indicating that the box had not been opened in many years. The visitor took out the small, ornate key they had found earlier and inserted it into the keyhole. Turning the key slowly, the visitor heard a faint click as the mechanism within the box unlocked. The lid of the box creaked open to reveal a collection of dark, twisted relics and an old, yellowed parchment. The relics were intricately carved and seemed to radiate a dark, malevolent energy. The parchment was covered in dense, cryptic text and disturbing illustrations. The illustrations depicted scenes of ancient rites and forbidden knowledge, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. The text was indecipherable, but clearly significant. As the visitor examined the contents of the box, they felt a sudden, icy chill sweep through the chamber. The temperature dropped sharply, and the flickering light from the torches cast eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. The visitor could sense an overwhelming presence, as if the vault itself was alive with dark, unseen forces. The visitor set the box and parchment aside and turned their attention back to the massive stone vault. The intricate lock and heavy chains were a reminder of the house's malevolent past, a hidden repository of dark secrets and forbidden knowledge. With a sense of profound unease, the visitor examined the vault's lock more closely. The lock was covered in dark, swirling symbols, its design matching the carvings on the vault and the artifacts found in the chamber. The visitor could feel a faint, pulsing energy emanating from the lock, a palpable sense of malevolence. The visitor knew that they had uncovered only a fraction of the house's hidden secrets. The vault, with its dark symbols and heavy chains, was a focal point of the house's darkness, a place where forbidden knowledge and ancient rites had converged. The true nature of the house's malevolent history remained concealed, waiting to be revealed by those who dared to confront the shadows that lay within. Chapter 23. The Descent into the Abyss. The visitor continued their journey deeper into the house, their path illuminated only by the faint, flickering light of their lantern. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them as they moved through a series of narrow, twisting passages. The air grew colder and more oppressive with each step, and a sense of foreboding grew stronger. The walls of the passages were lined with old, cracked stone and covered in a thick layer of grime. Faint, ghostly whispers echoed through the corridors, creating an unsettling atmosphere. At the end of one passage, the visitor discovered a heavy, iron door partially hidden behind a tattered curtain. The door was adorned with dark, intricate carvings and covered in a thick layer of dust. The carvings depicted nightmarish figures and arcane symbols, their details obscured by age. The visitor pushed open the door and stepped into a large, cavernous chamber. The room was vast and shrouded in an oppressive darkness, its high ceilings lost in shadow. The only light came from a series of flickering torches mounted on the walls, their flames casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted. In the center of the chamber stood a large, circular pit. The pit was filled with a dark, viscous substance that seemed to writhe and shift as if alive. The substance emitted a faint, malevolent glow, casting an eerie light across the chamber. The pit's edges were lined with strange, pulsating symbols that seemed to change and shift in the flickering light. The visitor approached the pit with a sense of dread. The surface of the substance was dark and opaque, its depths obscured by the viscous, shifting material. The visitor could feel a faint, pulsing energy emanating from the pit, a palpable sense of malevolence. Nearby, the visitor discovered a large, weathered pedestal covered in an assortment of strange, ritualistic artifacts. The pedestal was cluttered with dark, twisted relics, ancient tomes bound in cracked leather, and small, intricately carved amulets. The artifacts were covered in a thick layer of dust, indicating their long abandonment. On the pedestal, the visitor found an old, tattered book bound in cracked leather. The book was open to a page filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals and forbidden rites. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice, occult ceremonies, and ancient deities, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. The visitor's attention was drawn to a large, ancient chest resting beside the pedestal. The chest was bound with heavy, rusted chains and adorned with dark, arcane symbols. The chains were old and corroded, their surfaces covered in dark, corrosive stains. The chest seemed to radiate a faint, ominous energy. With a sense of growing unease, the visitor carefully examined the chest. The intricate symbols on the chest matched those found on the pit and other artifacts throughout the chamber. The lock was large and complex, its design suggesting a connection to the house's dark and forbidden rituals. As the visitor approached the chest, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the chamber. The temperature dropped sharply, and the flickering light from the torches cast eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. The whispers in the darkness grew louder and more insistent, filling the chamber with an oppressive sense of dread. The visitor carefully examined the lock on the chest and noticed a small, hidden compartment concealed within its base. The compartment was covered in intricate carvings and had a small, rusted keyhole. The carvings on the compartment matched those found on the chest and other artifacts throughout the chamber. Taking out the small, ornate key they had found earlier, the visitor inserted it into the keyhole and turned it slowly. The mechanism within the compartment clicked, and the small panel swung open to reveal a hidden drawer. The drawer was filled with old, yellowed documents and a small, dark box. The visitor pulled out the documents and carefully examined them. The documents were covered in dense, cryptic text and disturbing illustrations. The illustrations depicted scenes of ancient rites and forbidden knowledge, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. The text was indecipherable, but clearly significant. The visitor's gaze shifted to the small, dark box resting at the bottom of the drawer. The box was intricately carved and radiated a faint, malevolent energy. The carvings on the box matched those found on the chest and other artifacts. With a sense of trepidation, the visitor carefully opened the box. Inside, they found a collection of dark, twisted relics and an old, yellowed parchment. The relics were intricately carved and seemed to radiate a dark, pulsating energy. The parchment was covered in cryptic symbols and disturbing illustrations. As the visitor examined the contents of the box, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The chamber, with its dark pit, eerie artifacts, and ominous chest, was a focal point of the house's malevolent past. The true nature of the house's darkness remained hidden, waiting to be revealed by those who dared to confront the shadows that lay within. Chapter 24. The Awakening. The visitor, their sense of foreboding growing stronger, left the Chamber of Shadows and ventured into an even deeper section of the house. The passage they entered was narrow and winding, its walls lined with old, cracked stone. The air was cold and heavy, filled with the scent of damp earth and decay. The visitor came upon a heavy, iron door at the end of the passage. The door was covered in dark, swirling symbols and intricate carvings that seemed to pulse faintly with a malevolent energy. The visitor's lantern light flickered against the door's surface, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted. With a deep breath, the visitor pushed open the door and stepped into a vast, underground chamber. The room was cavernous and shrouded in an oppressive darkness, its high ceilings lost in shadow. The only light came from a series of flickering torches mounted on the walls, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. In the center of the chamber stood a massive, ancient altar made of dark, weathered stone. The altar was covered in intricate carvings and dark stains, suggesting it had been used for dark, forbidden rituals. The carvings depicted scenes of ancient rites, nightmarish figures, and arcane symbols, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. Surrounding the altar were several large, weathered statues, each depicting grotesque, otherworldly figures. The statues were covered in grime and cobwebs, their expressions twisted into forms of silent agony. The statues seemed to watch over the altar with a malevolent, unseeing gaze. The visitor approached the altar with a sense of dread. On the surface of the altar were several dark, twisted relics and ritualistic tools. The relics were intricately carved and seemed to radiate a dark, pulsating energy. The tools were covered in dark, dried stains and had an air of forbidden knowledge. Beside the altar was a large, ancient book bound in cracked leather. The book was open to a page filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals and forbidden rites. The illustrations depicted scenes of sacrifice, occult ceremonies, and ancient deities, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. As the visitor examined the book, they noticed that the room was filled with a faint, rhythmic vibration. The vibration seemed to emanate from the altar and the surrounding statues, creating an unsettling feeling of anticipation. The visitor could not determine the source of the vibration, but felt that it was connected to the chamber's dark history. The visitor's gaze was drawn to a small, hidden compartment in the base of the altar. The compartment was covered in intricate carvings and had a small, rusted keyhole. The carvings on the compartment matched those found on the altar and other artifacts in the chamber. Taking out the small, ornate key they had found earlier, the visitor inserted it into the keyhole and turned it slowly. The mechanism within the compartment clicked, and the small panel swung open to reveal a hidden drawer. The drawer contained an ancient, dark amulet and a collection of cryptic documents. The visitor carefully examined the amulet and the documents. The amulet was crafted from dark, polished stone and inscribed with arcane symbols. It seemed to radiate a faint, malevolent energy. The documents were covered in dense, cryptic text and disturbing illustrations. The illustrations depicted scenes of ancient rites and forbidden knowledge, their details rendered with chilling accuracy. As the visitors studied the contents of the drawer, a sudden, intense cold swept through the chamber. The temperature dropped sharply, and the flickering light from the torches cast eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. The rhythmic vibration grew stronger, filling the chamber with an oppressive sense of dread. The visitor felt a palpable sense of presence, as if something ancient and malevolent was awakening within the chamber. The air grew thick with a dark, pulsating energy that seemed to emanate from the altar and the relics. The visitor could sense that the chamber was a focal point of the house's dark history, a place where forbidden knowledge and ancient rites had once converged. With a sense of profound unease, the visitor stepped back from the altar and the hidden drawer. The chamber, with its dark relics, eerie amulet, and rhythmic vibration, was a reminder of the powerful forces that lay hidden within the house's shadows. The true nature of the house's darkness remained concealed, waiting to be revealed by those who dared to confront the awakening malevolence that lay within. Chapter 25. The Final Confrontation. The visitor, now deeply unsettled, ventured into the final chamber of the house, their lantern casting long, flickering shadows along the walls. The chamber was vast, its high ceilings lost in an impenetrable darkness. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional, eerie creaking of the old structure. The chamber was dominated by a colossal, ancient structure at its center, a massive, stone obelisk covered in dark, swirling symbols. The obelisk seemed to emanate a faint, pulsating glow that cast an unsettling light across the chamber. The symbols on the obelisk were similar to those found throughout the house, their design hinting at dark and forbidden knowledge. Surrounding the obelisk were several large, darkened mirrors mounted on the walls. The mirrors were old and grimy, their surfaces distorted and warped. The reflections they cast were unsettling, displaying ghostly images and shadowy figures that seemed to move independently of the actual surroundings. At the base of the obelisk was a complex arrangement of ritualistic artifacts. The artifacts were scattered across a large, circular stone platform, their dark, twisted forms radiating a malevolent energy. The platform was covered in strange, pulsating symbols that matched those on the obelisk. The visitor approached the obelisk with a sense of dread. On the surface of the platform, the visitor noticed several old, weathered tomes bound in cracked leather. The tomes were open to pages filled with detailed illustrations of dark rituals, occult ceremonies, and ancient deities. The illustrations were rendered with chilling accuracy, depicting scenes of sacrifice and forbidden rites. The air in the chamber grew colder and heavier as the visitor moved closer to the obelisk. A rhythmic vibration seemed to emanate from the obelisk and the platform, creating an unsettling feeling of anticipation. The whispers that had been faint throughout the house now grew louder, filling the chamber with an oppressive sense of dread. The visitor's gaze was drawn to a hidden compartment at the base of the obelisk. The compartment was covered in intricate carvings and had a small, rusted keyhole. The carvings on the compartment matched those found on the obelisk and other artifacts throughout the chamber. Taking out the small, ornate key, the visitor inserted it into the keyhole and turned it slowly. The mechanism within the compartment clicked, and the small panel swung open to reveal a hidden drawer. The drawer contained an old, dark amulet and a collection of cryptic documents. The visitor examined the amulet and the documents with a sense of growing unease. The amulet was crafted from dark, polished stone and inscribed with arcane symbols. It seemed to radiate a faint, ominous energy. The documents were covered in dense, cryptic text and disturbing illustrations, depicting scenes of ancient rites and forbidden knowledge. As the visitor studied the contents of the drawer, the rhythmic vibration in the chamber intensified. The temperature dropped sharply, and the flickering light from the lantern cast eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. The mirrors surrounding the obelisk seemed to come alive, their reflections growing more distorted and unsettling. The visitor felt an overwhelming presence, as if the chamber itself was awakening with dark, malevolent energy. The air grew thick and oppressive, and the whispers in the darkness became a cacophony of incomprehensible voices. The chamber was a focal point of the house's darkness, a place where forbidden knowledge and ancient rites had converged. With a sense of profound trepidation, the visitor approached the obelisk. The pulsating symbols on its surface seemed to shift and change, their dark energy radiating throughout the chamber. The visitor could feel the powerful forces that lay hidden within the obelisk, a manifestation of the house's malevolent past. In a final, desperate act, the visitor placed the dark amulet on the surface of the obelisk and stepped back. The moment the amulet touched the stone, the chamber was engulfed in a blinding, malevolent light. The rhythmic vibration reached a deafening crescendo, and the whispers in the darkness became an overwhelming roar. The light from the obelisk grew intense, casting a blinding glare across the chamber. The mirrors shattered one by one, their fragments scattering across the floor. The pulsating symbols on the obelisk and the platform glowed with an intense, otherworldly energy. As the light and energy reached their peak, the oppressive darkness of the chamber seemed to dissolve. The rhythmic vibration ceased, and the whispers in the darkness faded into an eerie silence. The obelisk's glow dimmed, and the chamber was left in a state of eerie calm. The visitor, exhausted and shaken, surveyed the aftermath of the final confrontation. The chamber was still and silent, the malevolent presence that had once filled the space now seemingly subdued. The true nature of the house's darkness had been confronted, and the ancient forces that had once held sway were now in a state of uneasy dormancy. With a sense of weary resolution, the visitor made their way out of the chamber and through the house. The darkness of the house had been partially revealed, and the malevolent energy that had once permeated its walls was now in a state of uneasy stillness. The visitor knew that the house's secrets were far from fully uncovered, But for now, the darkness had been confronted, and the shadows had been brought to light.